It certainly gives me great pleasure to moderate this panel of distinguished speakers on the topic of realizing the vision of African founders, progress towards Africa's trade and economic integration. His Excellency Wamkele Mene, the Secretary General, has just given us an inspirational address on the importance of the AFCFTA and Africa's economic integration. And indeed, this was the ambition of the founders of the Organization of African Unity in 1963. In fact, it is quite fitting that we are meeting in Abuja, because Abuja is the site where this ambition of integrating Africa economically was attributed and signed into an agreement on the Abuja Treaty, the establishment of the African Economic Community 34 years ago. But to dive into the discussions on progress and moving forward, I would like to invite to our stage our distinguished panelists. First up, I would like to invite His Excellency Kabin Kamara, the former Prime Minister of Guinea. Please give him a round of applause. I would also like to invite Mrs. Patience Okala, Senior Advisor representing the Honorable Dr. Jumoke Oduvole, Minister of Industry, Trade and Investment of Nigeria. I would like to invite Mr. Abdul Aziz Ba, Chief Executive Officer of the Africa Trade and Distribution Company. And finally, Dr. Gainmo Zanamwe, Director, Trade Facilitation and Investment Promotion at Afreximbank. Honorable Minister, my question will be directed to you. Nigeria, among the largest economies on the continent, a key driver of intra-African trade and a key player in the success of the AFCFTA. Could you kindly share with us some things that Nigeria has been doing in terms of driving the implementation of the AFCFTA, domestic the agreement, and making sure Nigerian businesses are able to take advantage of the opportunities it creates?
Thank you very much for the question. It's really a pleasure to be here, President Orama, and the entire Afrexim team. Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. So Nigeria's position with AFCFTA has taken a gradual acceleration. Let's put it that way. So AFCFTA implementation is now 5 years old, and I believe Nigeria is the first country to announce on the 16th of January this year, when we were visited by the Secretary General of the AFCFTA, our intention to complete our inaugural 5-year assessment, and that has since been done. Now, in February of this year, I inaugurated a central coordinating committee, which has all the right players in the room. So a lot has been happening in the country over the last 5 years, but probably not as coordinated as it should be. So that Central Coordination Committee, which I chair, has all the players that should be in it, from customs to NAFDAC to SON, everyone working in tandem with the private sector. And that has been really important. So for instance, when you come to practical implementation of what does that mean in practice to the MSMEs that we support, it means that, for instance, with UNDP, we negotiated a new air cargo corridor with Uganda Air, and we also mapped 13 southern and eastern African countries where Nigerian goods are in demand. We released a toolkit showing private sector where their goods are in demand, particularly MSMEs. So supporting those businesses, we had the flag off of that flight, of the maiden flight, about a month ago now, and practically helping them to trade. The Nigerian Export Commission, the Nigerian Export Promotion Council, has also been supporting female entrepreneurs in particular. They were in Namibia, and as we speak, the AU MSME Forum is taking place in Abuja right now. And that's where MSMEs across Africa come to trade. Of course, the biggest of such fairs is the Afrexim fair, which will be taking place in Algiers first week of September. So these are the practical ways, domestication and operationalization, or I've had a really long week, of AFCFTA implementation in Nigeria. So those are some of the key examples that I can start with. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Honorable Minister. And I think that gives me a good segue into my next question, which I'll be addressing to Mr. Ba from the African Trade and Distribution Company. One of the issues that the continent has faced is following the structural adjustment programs, the dismantling of commodity boards, the ability to aggregate and the ability to supply at scale within the continent. I know the ATDC tries to do some of this, but I'm going to ask you to talk us through what the ATDC is and the critical role that we see the ATDC playing in advancing the AFCFTA and intra-African trade.
Good morning, and thank you for this question, and thank you for having me here. I would like to thank also Mr. Professor Orama, who has kindly invited me to be part of this panel. So actually, ATDC, that stands for Africa Trade and Distribution Company, objective is really to be able to help to address those issues. It has been formed by FEDA through Afreximbank, by Arise IIP, and Equitan. The main purpose of ATDC is to be the African trader for commodities within Africa and move all the goods in transforming the goods within the continent and supplying some logistics help as well. We all know the problems we have in Africa to be able to be more integrated, and this is now the time to have a strong company that will help to address all these gaps and these issues. So our main job and function will be to buy from local communities, aggregate the different commodities, transform these commodities, and supply the logistics within the African continent. Goes from soft commodities to crude oil and to refined commodities. We also have the objective to incorporate in every countries some local ATDCs to help them to make them grow and develop this type of initiative. That's the job of ATDC.
No, thank you very much, Mr. Ba. And Dr. Zaramwe, turning to you, we know that since the establishment of the AFCFTA, since the signing of the agreement, and very often President Orama and His Excellency Wamkele talk about Afreximbank and the AFCFTA being twins. What are some of the major initiatives, programs that Afreximbank has put in place to support implementation of the AFCFTA, but also looking forward, what is planned, or what can we look forward to?
Well, thank you very much, Yusuf. And my job has actually been made very easier by the poet who started in the morning by telling us more about the 1963 decision that was made by the founding fathers. And what actually struck me from what the poet was saying, there are three main things that he highlighted, if any of you were listening. He talked about the very first decision that spoke about the need to introduce a payment and settlement system. He also talked about the importance of trade fairs. And most importantly, he talked about transit facilities. And I would like to go back to that 1963 decision, which is basically what Afreximbank has been focusing on through the leadership of Professor Orama. We actually have been working with the AFCFTA Secretariat to support the implementation of those practical things that will get the AFCFTA working. With regards to the transit guarantees, we have actually been working with the AFCFTA Secretariat to ensure that the vision of our founding fathers, to ensure that goods can actually move from Cape to Cairo with a single technology-enabled transit bond, it becomes a reality. Afreximbank is actually working with the AFCFTA Secretariat, put in place the African Collaborative Transit Guarantee Scheme, which is backed by a $1 billion facility. And we are already working with some of our partners, ZEPRE, which is a COMESA reinsurance entity. We are already issuing transit bonds that will actually ensure that trucks do not spend a lot of time on the borders, but they can actually move. It could be from Lagos all the way to Abidjan with a single transit bond. The other important initiative that you also heard about is the pan-African payment and settlement system. We know that annually we are losing about $5 billion in terms of transaction costs because we are not trading in our own currencies, in African currencies. Afreximbank, again working with the FCFTA Secretariat, has introduced the Pan-African Payment and Settlement System, which is currently operational, and we have now 16 central banks that have signed and more than 150 commercial banks. So Nigeria, of course, was one of the key countries that embraced the system, and it's working very well. We also introduced the African marketplace, which can actually allow the business people, corporates, to actually exchange local currencies. And a good example is actually what we've been doing with Zepre, and that has been working very well, as well as Kenya Airways. So these are some of the practical interventions that will actually liberate intra-African trade that is not currently taking place because we are waiting for Forex. With a Pan-African payment and settlement system, which has been endorsed by the AU Summit, we believe that we should be able to facilitate trade under the AFCFTA and reduce the costs of trading. And I also want to highlight another key initiative, which I think is very important in terms of facilitating intra-African trade, which is the trade fair. We go back all the way to the 1963 decision, where the leaders actually called for the introduction of trade fairs. We started with the All Africa Trade Fair, which was held in Kenya in 1972. But after another edition that took place in Egypt and Nigeria, the trade fairs did not continue. And it was through the leadership of Professor Orama, we managed to actually revive the trade fairs. And we started by hosting the inaugural Intra-African Trade Fair in Egypt in 2018. To date, I think the rest is history. We have managed to generate more than 100 billion US dollars in terms of trade and investment deals. And we actually brought together more than 70,000 participants to the 3 editions of the trade fair and more than 4,500 exhibitors. So we are now organizing the 4th Intra-African Trade Fair in Algeria, Algiers, from 4 to 10 September. And I would like to invite everybody in the room to make sure that you come to the Intra-African Trade Fair, where we are actually targeting to generate business deals that are worth $44 billion. We are targeting 2,000 exhibitors and more than 35,000 participants. So this is an Africa to Africa event that is actually going to solve the problem of lack of access to trade and market information. And we invite all of you to actually come to Algeria. Thank you.
No, thank you very much, Dr. Zanamwe. And there's a variety of interventions to support implementation of the AFCFTA from Afreximbank. And I think this is why I want to again turn to His Excellency, Mr. Komara. Earlier this morning, we heard Mr. Zubairu speak about the Alliance of African Multilateral Institutions. We had representatives of the diaspora. How do we use these networks? How do we use these institutions and use what the bank, like Afreximbank, is doing to support integration and to accelerate the AFCFTA and broader integration, particularly given the current challenges we face as a continent?
Thank you very much. I was very fascinated when I listened to what he said. One of the things I did appreciate with Dr. Orama, I worked with for 14 years at the bank. I left the bank to become prime minister in my country. When I left, he was just director of planning. The day he became vice president, things changed dramatically. He had a vision. He was committed. Not only was going to, he was enthusiastic. So every time he was laying down a foundation, I was writing to him when I was prime minister, when I go back to my context. Dr. Rama, I think the limit for you is the sky. Because he is always inventing and creating. Now, we must help him. How? It's good to have a policy. It's good to have a payment system. It's good to have a trade fair. But there are three main elements that we need to develop. First, we must absolutely develop infrastructure. No matter if you gather people in Algeria or in Egypt, how to move goods from Algeria to Conakry or to Lagos. We must combine efforts at all levels to increase massively infrastructure. Very important. To leave Conakry to Bamako, it's only 96 kilometers. In rainy season, we spend 5 days. Can you imagine the cost for move? We move Conakry to Sierra Leone, it's only 200 kilometers. You can do 2 days. So with those impediments, it will be very difficult to achieve the magnitude you want to achieve. That's number one. Number two is to go down onto grass level. Our traders are not fully equipped and informed and sincere about what ZLECAf can do and NAFTA can do. It is not very well known in many countries. We must continue to educate them, to tell them what is the importance, not to be at the political level. And that needs for us to implement in each country a branch or at least a certain institution that can promote intra-African trade. In many countries, you have Ministry of Foreign Affairs and African Integration, but that ministry does not play that role, and we must continue to advocate that. The third element is the payment system. Yes, we started that, but how many banks are implementing it? There are a lot of resistance. We must continue strongly at the level of not only of central bank, but at the political level, so that the African head of state can know that now they have a possibility to bypass foreign banks that are imposing on us a very high cost of transaction. We can do things by ourselves. And lately, is education, digital transformation. We need to invest in all different infrastructure, backbone, submarine cable, that we can reduce the cost of transaction. There is a lot of opportunity in that area. You cannot easily continue contact Nigeria and Conakry. If you start connecting, it breaks. So by facilitating the connectivity in many means, we can also encourage traders to work together. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Your Excellency. And I think those are critical points because we often hear about the challenges of infrastructure. We hear about the challenges our manufacturers and our producers face. And I'm going to use that as an opportunity to come back to you, Mr. Ba. How is the ATDC going to solve some of these challenges for us? We know that Africa has a multitude of SMEs, small-scale farmers. How do we use the ATDC and the national trade and distribution companies to integrate them practically so that they can take benefit of the AFCFTA?
Yeah, I think that's a very interesting question. And ATDC will help because all these problems, we know them already. So the industry in Africa is very fragmented. So having a national company that has the strengths, the skills to aggregate, to produce enough volumes to be able to move the ships around Africa from one place to the other one, to aggregate, to transform, because we have industrial zones in Africa, is part of the journey. So having a local national champion that is capable of trading with small SMEs, medium SMEs, aggregate, have enough volumes and size, build the infrastructure, help on the logistics side to be able to transform those goods in Africa and then export within the continent. That's why it's important to have policymakers, strong banks, and private sector to come together, to join hands, to leverage on what is existing already. Africa infrastructure now is getting much better than before. There's still some bottlenecks in terms of clearing some customs because of the logistics issues. We need to have enough size, enough mass to be able to track interest from the biggest shipping lines, and that's what ITDC is doing today. We work with areas in IIP in different zones. We have enough volumes in terms of commodities. We will have some partnership in many countries in Africa, in Nigeria, in Zimbabwe, in Benin, in other countries, to have local ATDCs in Malawi to be able to speak with the farmers, integrate their goods, have enough volumes, and then ship them around the globe. We'll have enough facilities with Afreximbank and local institutions to be able to have the working capital that is needed. But what is critical is to have enough volumes, size, at one single entry point. And that's the vision that our funders have, and now we're coming to execution. This is the way we believe that ATDC can be able to support the integration of African economies.
Oh, thank you very much, Mr. Bayan. This is quite exciting and quite innovative approach to addressing some of the challenges that the continent is confronting. Honorable Minister, I'm going to come back to you now, specifically in the context of Nigeria. How is Nigeria positioning itself with ATDC? How is it taking advantage of some of the programs and initiatives that Dr. Zinamwe talked about, that Afreximbank has put out there? And what more would you like to see? What would you like to see Afreximbank, our other institutions, doing to support Nigeria take advantage of the AFCFTA?
Thank you very much for that question, Yusuf. I thought you were being a bit modest, probably not to upset some of your other partners. But last Saturday, in the presence of President Bola Ahmed Tinubu at the West African Economic Summit, we had the privilege of announcing a collaboration that we're entering into with ATDC. That's Nigeria's probably your first. So let's acknowledge Nigeria, always the first. So what that would do for us is that we're using the Nigeria Commodities Exchange, which is one of the agencies under the Federal Ministry of Industry, Trade and Investment, and working with ATDC. It will be an operational entity of the ATDC on ground and definitely would reduce post-harvest losses. We all know the challenges of post-harvest losses across our countries. Nigeria is no exception, and so this aggregation will help that. And then it will structure commodity courts, so to make sure that commodities can be organized and they can get a better cost, a better returns on their goods. Also providing market intelligence, both in country and across the board and global commodities markets. So market intelligence asymmetry is somewhere where we suffer a lot, and we suffer losses because of that. And selfishly on our end, it helps us to revitalize the Nigeria Commodities Exchange as a hub for structured commodities exchange. So we have a lot of aggregators coming to the country. We have cost of food issues. We have food security concerns that we're addressing, and this is one of the areas that is very, very dear to Mr. President's heart. So it's unlocking the power of our domestic markets regionally, and it's going to position Africa very strongly in the global commodities market.
No, thank you very much, Honorable Minister. I'm being passed a note here saying I need to wrap up. So I'm going to ask Dr. Zinamwe one more question before we wrap up. Dr. Zinamwe, His Excellency Kamara talked about something very important, digital innovation and the opportunities the technology sector provides for us. What is Afreximbank doing, particularly in digital innovation, that can support implementation of the AFCFTA?
Well, thank you very much. I think in terms of digital innovation, at Afreximbank, we basically believe that not only is the future digital, but even the present. We have already started working on the Africa Trade Gateway, which is basically our super digital platform that has got the Pan-African and Payment and Settlement System that I talked about, as well as our KYC due diligence platform, Mansa, and we also have got our market intelligence platform, Trada, and we also have got the Africa Trade Exchange. But we are going beyond that. We are actually also focusing on working on what we call digital borders to actually decongest the movement of goods through using technology to ensure that we introduce smart gates at the borders. This is what will make the AFCFTA to work. But also, maybe whilst I have the floor, the theme that we are talking about, for integration to really work, we need to focus more on industrialization and value chain. And this is something that His Excellency Wamkelemen has always been talking about. But we need to do more of that, identify potential regional value chains, and ensure that we support those value chains with financing. And at Afreximbank, we already have been doing a lot of that. For supporting intra-African trade value chains, we've actually disbursed more than 20 billion in our first strategy. In the current strategy, we're going to disburse more than 40 billion to support some of the intra-African trade value chains. Some of you know what we've already done with Dangote. We are now even working on the minerals that we are actually going to add value to produce those batteries that are actually needed for the continent. So these are some of the issues, just to put the industrialization and value chain angle to the discussion on integration to make it meaningful. Thank you very much.
No, thank you very much, Dr. Zanamwe. And I think all that is left for me is Honourable Minister, please. Go ahead.
Not to say one or two things as a co-digital trade champion for the AFCFTA, and just to speak to the EDGE program that will be launched later this year. I'm sure the Secretary General may have spoken about it. But just to say that as the need for digital public infrastructure, Nigeria and Republic of Benin may be the first to have a digital border, soon also probably with the support of Afreximbank. So we continue to champion for the whole continent, attracting capital and investment into all these areas that will benefit the whole of the region using the AFCFTA. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Honourable Minister. Distinguished guests, I think for me, all I need to say and to wrap up and to take the insights from all our panelists is that African integration is something I've been working on my whole life. I've done the research, I've done the history on it, and His Excellency Wamkele talked about the signing of the AFCFTA agreement in 2018, the fastest ratifications, 49 ratifications, 54 signatories, and just in a space of 7 years, having worked in the trade negotiation space, what is quite inspirational is to see that we are not just talking about drafting agreements anymore, but we are seeing practical solutions to drive implementation and to drive trade. And for that, we've got to thank our panelists for their insight and for their valuable experience, and we'll still be calling on you to do a lot more. So thank you, everyone. Please give them a round of applause.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the next session. With that said, I would like to welcome the two former presidents of Afreximbank, President Edordu and President Ekra, please. Thank you. President, maybe we can get on with it. One, in the context of the theme for the conference, building on decades of resilience, one, and two, I think in the best interest of one, the bank, two, its shareholders, and for me, very importantly, in the context of the people that run the bank, I think institutional memory is hugely valuable. I wanted, just from a background point of view, President Edordu, where did you first hear about Afreximbank and what was your journey to joining the bank?
Thank you very much. I was a part of the very first efforts to set up the bank. I was in an Exim Bank myself, the Nigerian Export-Import Bank. As it turns out, Exim banking is not very popular. To tell the story of how Exim banking came into our continent is a very long tale, and I will spare you that. when Ndiaye made a proposal in 1987 to set up a mechanism for dealing with the problem of trade finance, he was really talking about unavailability of short-term financing. And 3 meetings were held. What was going to emerge was unclear. There were all sorts of ideas. Set up a unit in ADB to provide to fill the gap of retreating foreign banks who previously provided trade finance facilities to Africa, short-term trade finance facilities. Set up a totally new institution, which was even a subsidiary idea. What was more thought of was set up a unit in ADB. So 3 meetings were held. One in Cairo, one in Harare, Zimbabwe, and the final one where we now finally made up our mind in Cote d'Ivoire. Through these 3 meetings, all sorts of ideas were exchanged by potential stakeholders in what eventually became Afreximbank. I was already in an Exim bank, the only one in Sub-Saharan, perhaps, strictly speaking, the only one in our continent. And when I look at what Professor Rama has done with the bank, and what was originally thought of, is that comparing, completely different things. What was originally thought of was purely a short-term trade finance institution. When I look at the background document prepared by our team in Afreximbank, they talk about, the bank was providing short-term trade finance, and it looks odd. But at that time, that was what was needed. That was what was thought was going to be the aim of the bank. Indeed, in Zimbabwe, when a few of us who were already in Exim banking suggested that we should consider medium-term financing, there was revulsion, a huge debate. And it took the skill of Ndiaye to persuade the audience that we should accept as an interim solution in the mandate of the bank the possibility that the bank could deal with medium-term financing. It was something that was accepted as what will happen in due course, a long term after. It was not something that will happen perhaps not even in the first 30 years. But look at where we are.
Thank you, Mr. President.
And, all through this process of defining purpose, what I found in the DNA, which has become the DNA of our bank, is the term resilience. As I pondered the theme of this forum, I have nothing but immense commendation for those who articulated the idea of resilience as what has driven our bank.
Mr. President,
I'll stop there.
Resilience is a theme I would like to come to.
Okay.
So I'm going to plead that you don't beat me to the question. President Ekra, same question. Your journey to or introduction to the bank, one. And two, at some point, the bank migrates from concept, very difficult to bring life to a startup, because Afreximbank was a startup at some point. At which point did you feel collectively as the leadership of the bank that this is now beyond concept? This has the potential to evolve into the systemic institution that it is today?
Actually, mine started as an emotional issue, if I would call it that way. I was with Citibank in the late 80s when Babacar Ndiaye called me and a couple of other people and talked about this project that he had and asked us our views. I had no clue at that time that several years later, I'll be joining the bank. I was doing what I called a very good career at Citibank at the time. The Ivorian government called me to go and manage the post office and the post saving bank. Later on, Mr. Sardanis called me to join Meridian Bank. And then a good friend of mine and a friend of the bank, Akiwumi Thompson, the late Akiwumi Thompson, called me one day and said that I should apply for the position of Executive Vice President of Afreximbank. It was actually, in my career, the first time I was applying fully for a job. Usually I was handpicked. So I said, but why should I go to Cairo? He said, no, it's a very important institution. And send me The Economist, which are the advert. I did apply, and the rest is history. I met President Edward, who was in the panel who was interviewing me, and I was asking myself, but what would I do in such a place? Technically, I thought I was equipped, but never worked in such an environment, particularly a startup, as you said, and an African startup. But I think at that time I made the right choice. When eventually I was successful in my application, and President Edodu gave me 1 month to join, which was too short for a family, a father of 5 children, to just stop everything and go to Cairo. I asked if I could have an extra month. He said no more than that. So I eventually went there. He gave me a lot of documents to start reading. And he said, you have about 15 days to find a house. Finding a house in 15 days in Cairo in 1996 was not a straightforward matter. So eventually I had to call my wife to come and look for the house, because after 1 week, President Edodu called me and said, I hope you're finished reading those documents, because trade finance cannot wait. You have to hit the ground and run. So that's how we started. And of course, the basic thing that was being done at that time was building the foundations. Because by the time I got there in 96, the bank was still at the startup, as you call it. So we were at that stage. And it was effectively for me the first time I was creating something, but he has created Nexi at the time. So I was just following his steps.
Fascinating. Thank you, President. I'll combine 2 questions in one, if you don't mind. The first, in the Vista Bank sponsored hologram of President Babacar Ndiaye, the visionary, as we've all recognized. He talks about traveling to Cape Town and seeing the statue of Cecil John Rhodes, and that anchoring him from an inspiration point of view. Question number 1 is, what was that anchor inspiration for you in the work during your tenure at Afreximbank is the first. The second question, the theme is building on decades of resilience. The word resilience for you.
Trying to deal with or recall the motivation of Ndiaye. As I said earlier, if you look at the feasibility study that informed the establishment of the bank, everything that was in it was about short-term trade finance. There was no, it didn't about long-term, even medium-term. As I said, it was after the first meeting in Cairo, it was all short-term. Some participants hinted at the possibility of longer-term facilities by the bank, but eventually the idea was a footnote. By the time we got to Zimbabwe, ideas had matured, and people now began strongly to talk of longer-term financing. So the original motivation of Ndiaye was deal with the gap created by retreating banks because of what had happened initially. Now, responding with both short-term facilities by our bank and longer-term facility was something that came later and required what, as I ponder the DNA of the bank, required resilience, capacity to tolerate other views, capacity to tenacity, grit, capacity to look ahead and deal with, resist difficulties. So the original idea of Ndiaye was a short-term financing bank, and this now matured later. And as I look at what this bank has become, it was not intended as a development bank. But much of what we're doing now is development. And much of what we're doing now is responding to change and adapting our tools to bring those changes. And what it has meant is that in our DNA is this issue of resilience, capacity to respond to difficulties, capacity to deal with painful conditions. And therefore, I want to commend those who really articulated it. It is the critical part of the Afreximbank DNA. And if there's anything I would recommend that our team take away from this, is to recognize that as a cultural issue. It has become the culture of the bank. Whether we are talking about the way we dealt with Zimbabwe as a result of the effects of land reform, or the way we dealt with the problems of Kenya as a result of a couple of local problems, or the way we dealt with supporting trade services, or even longer-term project finance that sometimes had nothing directly with trade itself, quality assurance, and the kinds of production centers that we now have around our continent. Those were not necessarily issues that were anticipated. These kinds of responses mean that we have resilience in our DNA.
Thank you, President. And I think you bring out some really important points that I think people who are maybe not inside the institution may not have insight into. I think it's an important lesson. I mean, the migration from short-dated instruments to longer-dated instruments, assets and liabilities, is really out of a market need. And that's the proposition of Afreximbank, that we respond to market demand. It's very difficult to trade if you don't have trade-enabling infrastructure, for example. President, the 2 points, your inspiration.
Well, I can simply add a few things. You know, you also have adversity, which you have to deal with. It's not only the external environment as a geopolitical or economical environment, which is there to stay. The economic and geopolitical situation of the late 80s, beginning of the 90s and so on, was an environment that led to the creation of the bank. So you develop the instruments to deal with that. But beyond this, you have adversity. When the bank was being established, the whole issue or idea of Afro-pessimism was prevailing. I remember vividly, before I came to the bank, a few months before, I was at a dinner with a diplomat, a German diplomat, who was saying that Africans cannot manage banks. He said it at the dinner, just in front of everybody. Is he in the room? No, he cannot be here. And it was a time when the World Bank was doing the so-called structural adjustment program, and many banks were being closed in the continent. In my own country, in 1.5 years, 4 banks were closed. Development Bank. So, when someone makes such a statement, for me, it's an adverse statement. It's someone who does not want you to succeed. So, to deal with that, you have to develop the proper attitude to show that it's not because you are African, but you are a human being who can actually achieve things. And you develop that culture within the bank of how can we do something rather than why can't we do it.
Thank you, President. And a question to both of yourselves, President. Afreximbank, and I think institutionally we say this with all humility, has grown and developed to become systemic in the African economy. How do we sustain it?
Say that again.
Afreximbank has become systemic in the African economy. How do we sustain it?
Oh, a very interesting question. As I said earlier, so many of our earlier speakers said resilience is not enough, perhaps. Well, I think resilience is a lot. People like Paul Collier, an icon in African development issues, I said, problems of Africa are so many that it's really pointless listing them. They are fairly well known. To talk about the problems is probably pedestrian. The question is what to do about it. Now, if you look at our past, the way we have responded to those problems has meant that the bank has cultivated resilience, capacity to respond to problems, capacity to bear the pains and deal with risks as they emerge, capacity to deal with new issues. Once the bank has this and equally develops innovation, that equips it to face the situations as they emerge. Whether the problems are internal to the bank, internal to Africa, or they are motivated by geopolitical conditions as are emerging now, the resilience the bank has developed equips it. Whether we are dealing with treasury issues, the bank is non-deposit taking, but was equipped with the capacity to go to the market and seek resources. But the market is being strained. For example, about 2 to 3 weeks ago, I heard of problems of rating the bank. Well, the bank is rated by several agencies, but even if its rating declines and therefore accessing the market is affected in some way, the bank has cultivated the resilience to deal with that problem. The bank has got the innovative capacity to deal with that, to access funds. I want the bank to establish an internal recognition of this DNA feature as part of its culture. Once you recognize this, that equips you to deal with the future.
Thank you, President.
Yeah,
President
I think he just said it. That's a question of culture. We have to make sure that the younger generations that are coming to the bank understand the culture, understands the objectives. It's never over. You know, you have to continue to fight. You have to continue to fight. And the external environment is changing. But one thing that seems to change very slowly is the recognition of the place of our continent in this whole global world. The way the Africa continent is drafted in the map monde is a small continent, whereas it has a size of 3 times Europe and so on. Everybody knows that. The perception that others have is such that we are pushed down. So you have to have a culture of fighting. And that needs to be passed on to the younger generation. I remember when I took over for President Eduardo, and I spent 5 years here, I was reflecting on how to turn the bank into a meaningful agent. At that time, our total balance sheet was 500 billion, and the total African trade was about 1 trillion plus. So I said to my colleagues, unless we reach at least 1 billion, we will be meaningless. The staff said, no, 1 billion, can you double? Eventually, in a year and a half, we reached more than 1 billion. 5 years later, we reached 3 billion. 10 years later, we reached 7 billion. Now, the bank is at almost 40 billion.
So, President Ekre, you mentioned uncertainty. The global environment today, within the context of the continent and the important role of the bank. President Orama has served his term. We're going into a transition period. What would you advise a new leadership?
What I will ask new leadership is to simply continue to apply. President Eduardo started by saying when we started, he said, let's put system in place, not people.
Yeah.
You put systems in place. If the systems are in place, then success is already there.
Thank you, President. President Eduardo, within that, I think what the bank has done really well, and also President Ekra touches on this, what the bank has done really well is groom a breed of young, very talented Africans and given them huge responsibility, which I think has been what has built the culture and has anchored the resilience of the bank. In one of our discussions, you mentioned the process of bringing your successor president from the beginning, and you mentioned some of the why him rather than anybody else. Would you be able to share with the audience? Because I just think it's important. These are decisions that young Afreximbank bankers will be faced with. Why President Ekra at the time?
One of the founding fathers of the bank kept on telling us, this bank was not created necessarily for reasons of finance. The money put in the bank by Nigerian entities, if they were looking for profit, they will use the money and set up Nigerian banks to make profit. Egyptian banks, the money they put in the bank could have been used in the same way. The critical thing is developing African systems and bringing African integration to bringing African development. Now, who are the people to bring this about? At the time the bank started, even recruiting Africans, even headhunting Africans to fill vacancies was difficult. You couldn't find people. But today, as I look into the bank, I see highly skilled people, highly motivated people. Attrition rate, people withdrawing from the bank, is perhaps the lowest you can think of in the industry. So we have a team, and it is something one must be proud of, that we had a team that with resilience could develop the instruments to deal with the problems and challenges we have in the trade finance arena in our continent today.
President Edordu, President Ekra, thank you so very much. I think they deserve a bigger round of applause than that.